Reading today is by Denise Leverton. It's been slightly adapted. But peace, like a poem, is not there ahead of itself, can't be imagined before it is made, can't be known except in the words of its making, grammar of justice, syntax of mutual aid.
A feeling towards it, dimly sensing a rhythm, is all we have until we begin to utter its metaphors, learning them as we speak.
A line of peace might appear if we restructure the sentence, our lives are making, revoking its affirmation of profit and power, questioning our needs, allowing long pauses.
A cadence of peace might balance its weight on that different fulcrum. Peace, a presence, an energy field, more intense than war, might pulse then. Stanza by stanza into the world, each act of living one of its words, each word a vibration of light, facets of the forming crystal.
When my next-door neighbor, Billy Carps, came home from Vietnam, I asked him if he had killed anyone. I was a teenager and I was pretty stupid about the world, and I know now that I must have hurt him with my words. I wish I could apologize to him. At the time, I was getting active in opposing a war that made no sense to me. I was reading books like Friendly Fire or Tim O'Brien's The Things They Carried. O'Brien wrote about his own experiences in Nam. From that book, he said, "The things they carried were largely determined by necessity. Among the necessities or near necessities were P38 can openers, pocket knives, heat tabs, wristwatches, dog tags, mosquito repellent, chewing gum, candy, cigarettes, salt tablets, packets of Kool-Aid, lighters, matches, sewing kits, military payment certificates, sea rations, and 2 or 3 canteens of water. Together, these items weighed between 15 and 20 pounds, depending upon a man's habits or rate of metabolism. Henry Dobbins, who was a big man, carried extra rations. He was especially fond of canned peaches in heavy syrup over pound cake. Dave Jensen, who was practiced field hygiene, carried a toothbrush, dental floss, and several hotel-sized bars of soap he'd stolen on R&R in Sydney, Australia. Ted Lavender, who was scared, carried tranquilizers until he was shot in the head outside of Tonquay in mid-April. Until he was shot, Ted Lavender carried 6 or 7 ounces of premium dope, which for him was a necessity. Kiowa also carried his grandmother's distrust of the white man and his grandfather's old hunting hatchet. Because you could die so quickly, each man carried at least 1 large compress bandage, usually in the helmet band, for easy access. Because the nights were cold and because the monsoons were wet, each carried a green plastic poncho that could be used as a raincoat or ground sheet or makeshift tent. With its quilted liner, the poncho weighed almost 2 pounds, but it was worth every ounce. In April, for instance, when Ted Lavender was shot, they used his poncho to wrap him up, then to carry him across the paddy, then to lift him into the chopper that took him away. The absurdity of war, the things they carried, included comic books to Bibles and the necessity of getting high. That was how I understood that war to be from what I was reading and what I saw on TV. It was absurd, my teenage self thought. We went to Vietnam on a lie, drafted people who were not senators' sons, especially people with no other avenues for upward mobility, Black and poor. I thought I knew what peace was, protesting the Vietnam War, marching down Woodward Avenue in Detroit, working to end the draft, getting in trouble with my parents for reading the underground newspaper, The Fifth Estate. But I didn't know what war was or what peace was. It wasn't just escaping to Canada, getting the right deferment or a high lottery number to avoid the whole mess in the first place. There are better ways of resolving conflicts and keeping peace in the world, and they require not running away, but engaging and staying engaged. And through protest and resistance, we did end the draft and the war in Vietnam. Now that the military is all volunteer, who could argue that people are being forced to go to war against their will? But is it any better now that there's no draft? If often people with little other options are the ones who enlist, then that doesn't feel right either. Well, though there are those with college degrees who may enlist and quickly become officers, it's an uneven system. And war has always been an absurd way of solving conflicts. You may remember the novel Catch-22. It was set in World War II and follows the story of John Yossarian, a bombardier. The catch is the absurdity of war, as Yossarian and others try to get out of it legitimately so they could go home. But here's Catch-22. They wanted to use mental illness, or they called it insanity, as an excuse to get out. Here's the way that works. Are you concerned for your own safety in flying these missions? Yes. Well, that's rational. So you can't be exempted on the grounds of insanity. Continue to fly your missions. Are you concerned for your own safety in flying these missions? No. Well, then keep flying the missions. It's absurd. There's no way out. And there's also horror as part of war. In the book Slaughterhouse-Five by Kurt Vonnegut, he writes about the destruction of the city of Dresden in Germany, bombed by the English and the Americans. Vonnegut writes, "He went down in the meat locker on the night that Dresden was destroyed. There were sounds like giant footsteps above. Those were sticks of high explosive bombs. The giants walked and walked. The meat locker was a very safe shelter. The Americans and 4 of their guards and a few dressed carcasses were down there, and nobody else. The rest of the guards had, before the raid began, gone to the comforts of their own homes in Dresden. They were being killed with their families." So it goes. It wasn't safe to come out of the shelter until noon the next day. When the Americans and their guards did come out, the sky was black with smoke. The sun was an angry little pinhead. Dresden was like the moon. Nothing but minerals. The stones were hot. Everybody else in the neighborhood was dead. So it goes. And we dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima and then on Nagasaki, which put an end to that war. Fiction, poetry, narrative are all ways of bringing the absurdity and the horror of war to those of us who are lucky enough to avoid such conflicts. I'm grateful to the authors and the artists. They are trying to engage us. It seems we're always at war. Our country was founded on violence and war. We took land and labor by force, went to war with other countries in the name of freedom. But in reality, we were expanding or protecting our own resources. Now the US is out of Afghanistan after 20 years. We ended our unprovoked invasion of Iraq. Is Iraq better without Saddam Hussein? Maybe. Is Afghanistan better? Maybe not. But I have to wonder, what is good about war? It seems like war should be our last resort for solving conflicts, doesn't it? How do we stop this horror and absurdity? And it probably feels a little beyond us here in our little UU community. And yet, there were conflicts like the Civil War or World War II, that we consider just and righteous wars? How would we have ended slavery or the Holocaust without war? Perhaps we should have gotten involved in these kinds of conflicts earlier. Something stands in the way of us intervening in the face of the horrors of genocide, like World War II or Bosnia. How do we live with ourselves when we don't get involved? It's not because we're anti-war as a country. It's so confusing. We talked about William Schultz a few weeks ago and his experiences in Darfur and other places through his work at Amnesty International. He argued for the use of force to prevent genocide. UU feminist and ethicist Sharon Welch cites him in her book, Real Peace, Real Security. Schultz recognized that the use of violence, even for the best motives, is morally dangerous. In such actions, we are indulging our baser impulses to keep others from indulging theirs. Welch goes a little further and writes, "We need, therefore, in addition to the typical constraints of just war traditions, a reminder of the reason for those constraints. We are not immune to the use of violence for narrow self-interest, nor immune from the brutality of unchecked power." In other words, enter war with caution. Violence is a slippery slope. Well, where does that lead us today? First, let me tell you just a little bit about Sharon Welch, a feminist and ethicist, former provost at Meadville Lombard Theological School and my advisor. I appreciate the opportunity to bring her to you. She has long advocated for peace. She's also held academic positions at the University of Missouri and Harvard Divinity School in areas like religious studies, women's and gender studies, educational leadership, policy analysis, and theology. And she helped start the Unitarian Universalist Peace Ministry Network. In her book, Real Peace, Real Security, Welch describes a concept called moral disengagement. This is a concept from social psychologist Albert Bandura. Moral disengagement is when we human beings do things that are morally abhorrent, things we would not normally do, the things that happen in war. We have to disengage from our moral selves because we believe there is no other way to solve this problem or advance this cause. We distance ourselves from our actions and deny that we may be causing any harm. Or we minimize the harms we've caused by using euphemisms like collateral damage or professional interrogation techniques rather than killing civilians or torture. And of course, there's the tried and true method of dehumanizing the victim. This is what we saw in the Holocaust and in genocide situations in our country and all over the world. These are the things we do to enable us to go to war, moral disengagement. Welch also cites Bandura, though, that the best way to end war and our moral disengagement is by seeing the humanity and the suffering in front of us. And again, I thank the authors and the poets. Bandura wrote that there is strong evidence that most people refuse to behave cruelly, even under unrelenting authoritarian commands, you know, what the boss tells you to do, if the situation is personalized by having people inflict pain by direct personal action rather than remotely, and they see the suffering they cause. The affirmation of common humanity can bring out the best in others. It is the counterweight to what Schultz is rightly worried about, imperfect as it is. It's only when we twist our minds away from our moral commitments that we can escalate pain and torture. Our focus needs to be on relationships and seeing our common humanity. This is how we can engage in the work of peace. Sharon Welch was from West Texas, and she writes about the mindset that comes from her growing up there, that place, a practical and neighborly place. She wrote in Real Peace, Real Security, "My own work in this area, both as an activist and as a scholar, is profoundly shaped by my life growing up on a ranch in West Texas and the ethos that surrounded us in that world. It was an ethos of responding to the vagaries of human life, whether dust storms, hard freezes, or shifting global markets and farm policies, with an audacious yet grounded pragmatic creativity. We work together to bring as much justice as possible, to grow as fine a crop as feasible within the constraints with the resources at hand." Like all of us, we learn lessons growing up, and Welch learned from her parents and her faith tradition. She wrote in her book After Empire, "My parents lived the prophetic mandate for justice without a prophetic denunciation of others. Their lives of service were not lives of self-sacrifice, but lives of relishing a larger self, a self fulfilled in creatively using their power to establish conditions of justice in their church, their work, and their community." Welch wrote a memo to Obama in 2009. It was published in the Cocoon magazine about the limits of war and force in solving crises. She said, "Given the limits of military force in establishing enduring security in either Iraq or Afghanistan, many governmental leaders and military officers are exploring concepts of integrated power and global citizenship. We can respond to ongoing unrest with 3 interrelated initiatives: peacekeeping, or early intervention; peacemaking, or negotiating agreements; and peace building, addressing structures of economic exploitation and political marginalization." She says, "These are ways of responding that allow us to act decisively to protect civilians from genocide and crimes against humanity, but do not take us into the spiral of all-out war with its devastating toll on civilians and military forces alike. Peace building through economic and political marginalization to end those things, those structural things. That's where we come in, isn't it? Structural change, though, is just about as difficult as ending war, I think. When oppression is institutionalized, it is intended to prevent change. Institutions are designed to create stability, but that stability can come at the cost of progress. To create change, we need to be in relationship with others, especially those affected by marginalization and exploitation. You know this, I preach it all the time. But if what you think about it as a way of building peace in the world, maybe that makes it more powerful. We are talking here about a sustained focus and effort to build and maintain relationships. Welch writes in her book After the Protests Are Heard that leadership focusing on relationships has many challenges. In order to make it work, those involved need staying power and curiosity. We can expect change to be challenged, but we can't really predict why, so we have to remain curious. We don't know what ideas will catch hold, and we can't control the outcomes, so we have to be persistent. But do we not owe it to our world to try? It's kind of the definition of our living tradition and our faith, isn't it? So why care about this? Welch introduced me to a book by Steven Pinker called The Better Angels of Our Nature. Pinker is a researcher who looked back hundreds of years at violence and argued that violence has declined over the long span of time. It may not feel like it right now with mass shootings occurring more than every day in the US right now. But Pinker cites declines in slavery, capital punishment, and torture as evidence that violence has gone down. Domestic violence, too. Pinker identifies 5 factors that have led to this decline in violence. He cites the rise of rights, especially women's rights. When women can go to school, marry on their own terms, and control their bodies, they can be more engaged in politics. It's empowering, reduces violence. Second is commerce. When we trade with other people, we're a little less inclined to go to war with them. Third is the expansion of our circle of sympathy. Who do we care about? How do we widen our circle of concern? Fourth is the escalator of reason, which moves us to create laws against violence and to create practices like democracy, restorative justice, nonviolent resistance, crime prevention. These are things that reduce violence. And the 5th factor is something we are working on here in the US, and that is to create a fair state and a judicial system that is restrained in the use of force and even-handed in the enforcement of laws, Pinker says. In our country, the Black Lives Matter movement has awakened us again to the bias and inequity in the criminal legal system. All these things reduce violence and create peace. Sharon Welch notes that Pinker's book came out in 2011, so it's a little bit older, and while Pinker demonstrated statistically that violence has declined, he was not an eternal optimist. He argued for ongoing vigilance, writing, "Declines of violence are a product of social, cultural, and material conditions. If the conditions persist, violence will remain low or decline further. If they don't, it won't." It seems like we're a little bit at risk right now. The social, cultural, and material conditions are on the decline, and we are seeing violence now. The push for human rights, especially in race and gender, has created a violent pushback. Welch argues that social change will always be met with virulent and contagious resistance. We've seen it. Just think about January 6th. Think about all the racist motivated mass shootings and the rise of white nationalism. And the very idea of white nationalism threatens to take us off that relationship stage. So maybe we can lean toward our better angels, as Abraham Lincoln told us in his first inaugural in 1861. We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection. The mystic cords of memory, stretching from every battlefield and patriot grave to every living heart and hearthstone all over this broad land, will yet swell the chorus of the Union, when again touched, as surely they will be, by the better angels of our nature. I invite you to consider looking into the UU Peace Ministry Network and the Creating Peace Statement of Conscience that was ratified by the 2010 UU General Assembly. That statement begins with these words: "We believe all people share a moral responsibility to create peace, mindful of both our rich heritage and our past failures to prevent war, and enriched by our present diversity of experience and perspective. We commit ourselves to a radically inclusive and transformative approach to peace." So when issues seem too big for us, where do we begin? Let's consider the words of Lao Tzu. If there is to be peace in the world, there must be peace in the nations. If there is to be peace in the nations, there must be peace in the cities. If there is to be peace in the cities, there must be peace between neighbors. If there is to be peace between neighbors, there must be peace in the home. If there is to be peace in the home, there must be peace in the heart. We can all begin in our hearts, but let us not forget our commitments. Commitments like those found in J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. Samwise Gamgee, a hobbit, had this to say to his dear friend Frodo Baggins when it seemed that all was at its worst on their difficult journey to destroy evil in the world. Sam said, "I know, it's all wrong. By rights, we shouldn't even be here, but we are. It's like in the great stories, Mr. Frodo, the ones that really mattered. Full of darkness and danger they were. And sometimes you didn't want to know the end because how could the end be happy? How could the world go back to the way it was when so much bad had happened? But in the end, it's only a passing thing, this shadow. Even darkness must pass. A new day will come, and when the sun shines, it will shine out the clearer. Those were the stories that stayed with you, that meant something, even if you were too small to understand why." But I think, Mr. Frodo, I do understand. I know now. Folk in those stories had lots of chances of turning back, only they didn't. They kept going because they were holding on to something, that there's some good in this world, Mr. Frodo, and it is worth fighting for. Amen. May it be so.